Hi everybody. So really lovely to spend a bit of time with you this morning, and I'll just kick off with thanks to Grad Consultant Handshake for setting this up. I think any spaces we can create to open up the discourse and dialogue around employability and how it integrates into the broader work of universities, I think is really welcome. I think too often we fall into a habit of panic responses to some of the challenges that employability present to institutions. And in doing so, we reach for easy answers and don't spend enough time in some of the kind of the joyous creative possibilities that they present to us. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'll share with you, I'm standing at my really posh standing desk, which looks a bit like an ironing board, but I assure you it's far more glam than that. It'll let me wander. If I wander too far, someone holler and tell me that I've disappeared off into the garden. Okay, so I'll kick off my talk, which I've failed to name in a peak of cowardice. But I'll start really by giving you a sense of the broad framing that sits around it. So before I get into the bits and bobs of what we're talking about, I just want to give you a sense of kind of the prelude and the focus of this, which is all around journeys, and it's journeys on lots and lots of different levels. So at the core, it's the outcome of some ongoing grapplings by me and colleagues in Manchester Met around the notion of a student journey and what journey actually means in the context of education. We've done lots of kind of teasing at some of the accidental implications we have in that, and some of the ways we can unravel some of those implications in order to construct different possibilities. So the second journey that I'm going to share with you is the journey of an institution. So how we've responded to that unsettling, and how we've learned from some of the things that students have done as we've done that. I'll talk a little bit about our co-curricular program RISE as an institutional strategy, and I'll explore some of the consequences and learning that's fallen out of that. And ultimately, what I want to do in this talk is I want to advocate quite strongly that we need to put down destination as a thing that we're preoccupied with in favor of a focus of the qualities and natures of those journeys. And that's a strange thing to do in the context of employability, where the destination is our kind of prime goal and focus. But hopefully what I'll do in this talk is I'll kind of advocate for putting that down and spending a bit more time with process and the ways in which that can help us meet some of the goals that we're intending to reach. The final journey that is involved in this is my journey. And I think probably it's useful to just give you, for transparency, a bit of a sense of me and where I come from and how you need to read how this talk works. So I'm an educator kind of through and through, a bit of Blackpool Rock with teaching run through it. I don't lean particularly into the research space. I'm very much practice driven. So when I give these talks, what they tend to be is kind of my naive meanderings through a set of experiences that I've accidentally constructed around me, and the ways in which the things that colleagues and students have done have provoked me to think in particular ways. So it's very much a kind of reflective framing within this. And as we get to the end of this talk, I'll highlight to you kind of 4 big bits of thinking that have come out of some of the experiments that we've undertaken. Okay, but moving on. Okay. Okay, so I just want to start by just noodling around a little bit with some of the spatialized language we use in education. So the concept of a learning journey is quite familiar discourse. We use it to talk about the developmental changes that happen in our students as a consequence of some of the things that we do to them. We also, in higher education, you don't get this so much in schools, we talk about a student journey as opposed to a learning journey. And what we do there is we proxy that it isn't just the classrooms that learning happens in, it's the broader ecology and infrastructure of the university. So notions of journey are there, they're embedded, they're ingrained, and they hold with them all sorts of presumptions and habits that I think are worth unsettling. So I think for me, one of the things that strikes me whenever I look at talk around learning journeys is that they tend to be based on very fixed endpoints and universal milestones. So what we do with our learners throughout the entire education system is we convey them from milestone to milestone to milestone. Right from the very beginnings of primary school, you're chasing a set of predefined outcomes and destinations that become more and more formal as our students progress. Up to the point where GCSEs and A levels, the development goals that are embodied in an exam are the things that are valuable in that particular journey. I think that's really interesting because I think actually what it does is it fails to attend to the notion of journey at all. What we often do when we talk about learning journeys is we talk about the dot to dot of learning destinations. And the process to which that mobilization from one place to the other doesn't really get trailed up in a way that it could do. And I think that's problematic, actually. And it's problematic not from an employability perspective. I'll come to employability a little bit later on. It's problematic because it's not a very human form of education. What it does is it takes the agency of the person out of the journey completely. They are there as a vessel to be conveyed towards universalized and ultimately imposed destinations, rather than somebody, as we kind of imagine a journey to be outside of education, something done by a person with their agency, with particular intents. So I want something better. And I want something better both for an employability reason, but actually for a much deeper reason. I think I want something better because I want a better form of education that will lead to a nicer form of employability. And the way I think about it is I want my learners to be adventurers rather than commuters. I don't want them to be doing the grind from one place that they have to be to another place that they have to be along the most efficient and efficacious mode of transit. I want something that enables them to wander. I want something that has space for emergence, for serendipity as a process. And most importantly, I want something where their agency is core to the reason that the journey happens. Okay, so as a quick aside, I talked about the education system as a whole in that previous slide. I'm going to go out there and say that universities, which we think of as bastions of free inquiry, are actually one of the most tightly framed set of journeys that we'll find. So you only have to look at the way that we construct our degrees around things like quality frameworks and subject benchmarks. We bring students into our institutions onto a discipline, and we value their success as the extent to which they are inculcated into the set knowledges, practices, and conventions of that discipline. And then ultimately, we are more and more then thinking with slight tongue-in-cheek about things like graduate outcomes. So again, what we're doing is we're defining that journey in terms of its destination rather than the qualities of the experience of moving through it. My counterpoint is early years practice, which is something that I would encourage anybody who gets a chance to go and look at a really good early years setting, because what you find there is something incredibly disruptive compared to the rest of our education setting. You find spaces where the impulses of the child are the driving forces of the education journey that they undertake. And what the role of the adult in that space is to scaffold the next step. So when you see a youngster taking an interest in a particular feature of their environment, you construct a learning journey that takes them to the next step around that. It's very, very different in terms of the epistemology, the validity of different learning content than we would find anywhere else. It almost immediately stops the minute they step out of a nursery and reception classroom into a year one classroom, and we start to get them school ready. That emergence and eruptives and adventurousness becomes lost. The other thing that you note in an early years setting is that another spatialized reference. So the notion of environment is really, really important to early years settings. The notion that the classroom is the stimulus for learning that doesn't necessarily contain possibilities, but opens them up. Again, very, very different to how we think about spaces and places as we become more formal in the education system, with the exception of things like studio learning. So it's more journey-like, and we might expect that what is built on that is an expansion of degrees of freedom. So we understand that there are limits to the capabilities of a 4-year-old. A 12-year-old has less limited capabilities, and we would hope that a 21-year-old has even fewer. So as they progress through the education system, the spatial possibilities of learning should get broader, but we find the opposite, things become tighter. I'm interested in the notion of educational landscape in that context, because if an environment is one particular zone of where learning happens, surely a landscape is the possibility to step between those different spaces. But we don't use it in that way. We talk about education landscape as something embedded in policy. So it's something that practitioners can engage with, but ultimately only policymakers can navigate and shape that landscape according to their ends. Okay, so some very, very broad conceptual framing around what we're going to talk about. It's about journeys, and it's about how we create journeys that produce adventurers. And it's about the way in which adventurers are more likely to have all of those things we want and we call employability. Okay, so moving on. I'll talk now very practically about the project that I run at Manchester Met, which is called RISE. It was a strategic project which was put in place. It was 3 years ago, but it's either 3 years or about 37 years in COVID time. Much has changed since that point. Its fundamental purpose, though, remains the same. I was seconded from an associate dean role at that point in order to find ways of creating an ambitious institutional co-curricular program which would allow students to be more than their discipline. So what we were doing was recognizing that all those things that we talk about around things like graduate attributes that aren't very well assured, and all of those things that are gained through things like extracurricular experiences are all valuable to how a student develops, and actually, therefore, as an institution, we should deal with them in a more formal way. We also recognized, however, that we don't have a student journey. At Manchester Met, we have 38,000 student journeys, and each of those journeys is voyaged by a unique individual with their own aspirations and passions and hang-ups and challenges. And what we needed to do is create a curriculum space that would allow them to hack and bespoke the things that they experienced in order to expose new possibilities which were specifically relevant to them. So just because you're an engineer doesn't mean, for instance, you don't aspire to work with people as a teacher. But a degree in engineering won't necessarily take you on that journey without you incorporating those experiences alongside that. So what RISE was set up to do was create that breathing room for students in which things could become more navigable. We also wanted to introduce an easier, more agile mechanism whereby we could take interventions to students quickly without the 3-year lead time that universities always face. So you probably, those of you who work in HEIs recognize this. It takes us 3 years to start anything, and then another 3 years to evaluate it, by which point the thing that we were addressing in the first place has moved on completely. So it's part of the point of RISE is to just bring those things to students quickly. We have an opportunity. We have a group that we know need a particular bit of support. We can bring it to them in that year rather than waiting. Very, very, very briefly, how RISE works. It's two things. It's an institutional credit framework in which we allow students to accrue points for non-course learning. So they might get a couple of points for an event. They might get a big whack of 300 points for doing a big project where they collaborate with each other. We introduce a milestone at 300 points in which they can write a reflective assignment, and which is about kind of integrating their experiences and communicating them to an outside audience. And that results in additional credits that count. So what this framework lets them do is to take all that infrastructure and broader ecology of learning that isn't their discipline, and it makes it part of the core Manchester Met experience. The way that the credits work is that they're in addition to their course credit. So they count if they are better than an option from their degree. If their options are all better than what they do in the reflective account, then it doesn't count. So there's no risk in it to students. There's only a gain that can be delivered off it. We also run quite an extensive experience program, which runs the full year round. My team love me for committing that we would do that. With a mixture of one-off events, funded mobilities, projects, placements. It's chaos in there, but it's chaos in the nicest possible sense. It's something that is open to all of our students from foundation year to PhD, from your standard undergraduate to your degree apprenticeship to a student on a franchise program working out in a college or an international program. So it's very much open to everyone. And then what we do is we identify students who we want to prioritize as an institution, and we double market everything to those students in order to make sure we don't end up with a situation where the students who are engaging with this are the ones who don't need it. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on content because I want to talk a little bit about journeys and why we did what we did. But just to give you a sense here of the kind of range of things that happen within RISE, we have very straightforward kind of skills courses. Come and do a course in a language. Come and find the nuts and bolts of machine learning as a sociologist for 6 weeks. We have things that are a little bit more ambitious. So we have projects where you gain a skill and then we work with a collaborative partner in order to put that in practice. So it might be you learn the basics of social media management, and then we pair you up with a charity or third sector organization without social media capability, and you take that practice into application. My favorite of these is some work we did on wellbeing in schools, and we brought a partner in who did very low level play therapy, art therapy training with our students, and then they went out and did a playground residential where they used lunch times and breaks to run some of the activities in a real space. It was a really impactful experience for students. We run simulated enterprises, so we have a media production company who each year runs something called Art School Live, which is a live streamed music festival over 2 days to end the year. Google it and come along to it this year. It's a really, really brilliant experience. But that's a really interesting one because it constructs a temporally bounded simulated bit of employment where we have accountants running the books of it. We have business managers trying to add extra capabilities to it. We've got social media managers, we've got journalists, and we've got all the techie students who do the actual live streaming involved. So it's a really kind of rich, vibrant, and again, slightly chaotic experience. Okay, so I just want to move on to that into a sense of why we do this in this particular way. So it was responding to a sense that the things that we needed to do in order to assure both the success of students within and beyond university, but also their sense of satisfaction and belonging and participation was more than just the kind of thin subject stuff, and more than just some of the bolt-on things that we do in order to do things like additional career support. There was something far more integrated around these kind of dimensions. And this is a ridiculously overworked diagram that I won't spend huge amounts of time with. But you can kind of see in there how we were trying to create a space for a much richer sense of formal learning in what we did, so that we could assure that you got work experiences, or at least experiences engaged beyond the university, that you would develop transferable skills, and there was a space where those skills that weren't your discipline but were relevant could be created. One of the things that I do want to reflect on, though, is that when we first started to design RISE, we looked at our students, in particularly those ones who were most at risk of underemployment. And what we were finding is a very common set of challenges for them. So one of them was around plasticity. So students unable to recognize the repurposedness of the assets that they had, and also the breadth of the assets. So you saw students who applied for an accountancy job because they'd done an accountancy degree. Didn't recognize how all of their other assets made them relevant to that particular career, edited them out as irrelevant. Similarly, we found challenges with some of our humanities students not recognizing the repurposefulness of the learning that they'd experienced, and actually there were places that they could go that would give real value to those skills, but they weren't recognizing them. We found issues around autonomy. So the capability of students to work independently within the things that they were being asked to do, but also to get out there and find opportunities, and actually get out there and apply for them. And then finally, we were spotting things around authority. And I think this is quite a useful term, because it's more than just confidence. We can do work to support students' confidence, but it's a very particular kind of confidence that gives you entitlement to access particular opportunities. And we were finding that particularly underplayed among students. Now, just to tie these two parts of the presentation together, I think there's a relationship there. So we're seeing that these three things we're kind of feeling in deficit in some of our students. And we can blame the student, and it's really, really, really easy to construct a discourse in which the student is the problem in these spaces. I don't think that's the case. I think these are the natural consequence of having occupied that educational experience on rails for your entire learning career. Those journeys where you are conveyed by somebody else from endpoint to endpoint to endpoint are always going to construct those kinds of consequences, and they're going to undermine our students' employability and capability to reach a graduate outcome. And they're going to do so in a way that is demographically patterned, because if you are more vulnerable to things like imposter syndrome, you're less likely to be able to knock yourself out of that railed experience. So what we wanted to do with Rise is unravel some of that in order to construct a slightly more open space where students did exercise these things as part of their learning experience. They were autonomous, they were operating with plasticity, and they were exercising authority over their capability to access different opportunities. But here's the problem. When you undermine those, you also take away the security, predictability, and comfort that comes with knowing that you are on a linear educational experience. So we end up in a position where actually our some of the drivers around our metrics are in contradiction with each other. So all of the things that we put in place in order to enhance student satisfaction by making them feel more supported and scaffolded and conveyed from space to space are at the same time undermining some of the things to do with graduate outcomes, and that we know we need to tackle if we're going to close some of our outcome gaps. It reminds me of is this. I'll show you a quick video.
What would you call a game where you have to pull out a stick but not let any marbles fall? The more that fall, the more points against you. At first, it's easy not to kaplunk. Then it gets a little harder. And sometimes it's nearly impossible. What would you call it? Kerplunk from Ideal, the good game, people.
Okay, so in the early iterations of Rise, I started thinking of what we were doing using the metaphor of Kerplunk. So we've got all of these bits of scaffold that we've put in place to support the student, that are in some ways getting in the way of their kind of autonomous development, and certainly their agentic navigation of an autonomous journey. So how do we take some of those scaffolds out without the whole thing collapsing? And it was a fun metaphor. I've got a Hungry Hippos one as well. You got like, it's how I run a lot of things. It's also a metaphor that has its limits, however, because it becomes something that is about damage mitigation rather than something that is about aspiration. And I was really thankful that my deputy, John Lean, kind of challenged this metaphor with a reference to another game. So what he brought to me was this. So anyone who's familiar with games may recognize this. This is Nintendo's Zelda Breath of the Wild. And just to give everybody else a bit of context, the way Breath of the Wild works is it's a massive open map. It's huge. It'll take you hours to run from one side of the map to the other. And it's full of all sorts of things that you can get absorbed with along the way. And what the game does is it plonks you in the middle of this map and it doesn't tell you what to do. It leaves you open to create your own adventure and find your own pathways through it and choose which way you're going to approach particular challenges. I think what's useful about this is it's grappling with very, very similar challenges to the challenges we have in trying to open up the education landscape for our students. So there are ways in which I think we can learn from the user experience process that games use in order to understand how we frame a learning process. And actually we can do some really interesting things where we use game as a perceptual metaphor, and we don't stigmatize that we play games when we learn. We just recognize that that's a human thing that we do. We work the rules out, we work within them, and we respond according to those, and there's ways that we can hack those games. So these are things that push us beyond a very simple gamification scheme. And I want to be really clear about that. So RISE has a points-based system, which is about tracking, it's about accounting. It could very easily be about creating a token economy, which is all about incentivizing engagement. That isn't really what we want to do with it. The gamification that we have here is a much deeper sense of how we learn from a process of engaging people and port it over to a separate place. Here's the principles that John put in place for us. So think about not just the experiences that we give students, the opportunities, but think about the landscapes that we present those on and how we invite students to engage in them, through them, and around them. We should do that in a way that frames a journey so that students don't end up terrified and lost, but we shouldn't dictate that journey. We should allow them to find their own ways through that. And the last 3 points kind of stem from that. So we also need to give students the tools to tighten the framing. So we give them a wide open set of possibilities. Some students thrive within that. Some students, their first impulse is to be absolutely terrified about it. So we need to give those students ways of reducing the degrees of freedom for a while in order to find their ways of navigating themselves through RISE. And we should expect that people will play in different ways. And one of the things that John's been really useful in kind of provoking me around is things that look like them cheating the process, rushing to an end, finding a particular point. Actually, let's not rush to think that those are illegitimate. Let's instead spend a little bit of time understanding how that particular play style serves the needs and purposes of that particular student. And if we want to take them in a different way, it's for us to go back to that very first point. How do you create the landscape that nudges them to play in slightly different ways? And then finally, coming back to the very first points that I made, we need to acknowledge the act of navigating these opportunities is as much learning as the things that happen within them. And I'm gonna whiz through some of these. So the Zelda Breath of the Wild has some really, really clever UX. They've thought very carefully about how the landscape can nudge particular behaviors. And that we've been testing our thinking in RISE around how we learn from some of those. So I'm going to give you two examples. So one of them is the Great Plateau. So when you start Zelda Breath of the Wild, you start on the top of a mountain that you can't get off until you've got a paraglider. And it's like a tiny bit of the play world in miniature. So you've reduced the degrees of freedom. And within that small space, you've learned all the techniques and tactics of the game before you finally get the paraglider and you jump off and you're into this much bigger world. And what we've done is we've taken that and we've framed our induction period, which takes place from September right the way through to Christmas, around a notion of a great plateau. So what students experience is a reduced version of Rise in which they gradually unlock other possibilities. So they undertake little courses around self-brand, which unlock another course, which lets you come to a speaker session where it's a bit of coaching about how you do that. So you gradually unlock various possibilities before they hit the Christmas period, at which point everything is open to them. Another thing that we've used is the notion of towers. So what Zelda does is it sticks you in a landscape with nothing to do. And it sticks a tower on the horizon. And impulsively, what you do is you run towards the tower because it's a point on the landscape. And then when you've climbed the tower, you get a better perspective, and therefore you can see new possibilities. We run what we call Rise Summits, which are great big TED Talksy type events that sit in the middle of terms, which act like towers. It's something that has a bit of gravity that draws you to them, that lets us pull students together and give them a perspective on the opportunities available to them. Okay, right. So whizzing onto the treasure. I'll do my obligatory page of stats. So Rise has been really successful. We started with a target of 300 students in year one, and an end goal that we would be engaging about 3,000 students a year. What that actually looked like was 14,000 students in 2021, and we're well on track to exceed that in 2022. So it's been wildly popular with students. And I think there's been something about the pandemic that has accelerated that, as they want agency over their experience through things like the lockdowns, and what we were offering within Rise was really appealing there. What I'm really pleased is that we overrepresent all of those groups who are most at risk of under engagement and tend not to be well represented within enrichment offers, which I've kind of listed there. The reason for that is very simple. It's the credits. But it's not the credits because those students need more incentivization. It's because they're juggling quite often very complex lives where prioritizing this thing that doesn't count against this thing that does. There's no competition. The minute you start to incorporate it into the formal learning process, they're much more easily justified to engage with. And we've done some pairwise comparison of the consequences of engaging with Rise, and we've seen impacts on careers readiness, fairly significantly, but also around things like academic achievement, not just because of the credits, but more broadly. We've seen increased continuation, and we've seen a really strong sense of community, which is something to do with the loose framing, I think, that we provide here. Just enough structure for there to be purpose, just enough looseness that you end up interacting with each other. Okay, and I'll close with 4 bits of learning from the adventurers, because what's happened in framing this up is students have occupied it, they've made it their own, and they've taught me some really, really interesting things specifically around employability. So learning number 1, I don't think we hold space for uncertainty enough, and I certainly don't think we do it enough in the career space, because our impulse is to get them to find a destination. And that's fine. At some point, we need to help them with that. But I don't think we have the structures and spaces which legitimize that you can arrive at university not knowing what you want to be when you grow up. I share with them that I don't know what I'm going to be when I grow up. And actually, what we should be doing is finding those mechanisms that legitimize the finding of self. Second thing that we've discovered is that employability isn't something viral. You don't drop them into a placement and they catch employable. There's a set of processes and transformations that happen as a consequence of that experience, which create the developments we call employability. And there's more than one way to deliver those. And I think there's some playfulness we can do, which will help us reach scale. We probably will never get every student into a sandwich year. What we can do is learn from the best transformations and create them in different ways. We found that communities and identities matter. And I think this kind of comes back to that first point about finding oneself. The interconnections that happen across disciplines, the senses of authenticity that students develop are really important. And we've started thinking an awful lot about the relationship between bridges and anchors, and in particular around widening participation. We quite often spend time pulling students out of their communities in order to give them social mobility. And I think that's a problematic dynamic. It's problematic because it's culturally a little bit aggressive. It leaves students alienated from their communities rather than embedded with them. And it doesn't make social mobility kind of flow down and transition. But it also fails to build capacity in the community that when they finish their degree will lift. So some of the things we're exploring now is how do we involve parents, families in the things that we do, and how do we empower students to gain experience by creating good in the communities they're already embedded in, because that will have a sustained impact. Okay, and then the postscript. So we've just signed off on RISE as a mainstream unit, and where we're heading next year is to scale upwards. So by next year, the goal will be 28,000 students, and over the next 3 years, pretty much every student we expect to be formally part of RISE in a significant way, in different ways as they journey through, but it will become part of the Manchester Met core USP and offer. Okay, and bearing in mind that we've probably only got 5 minutes left then, I'll pause at that point, say thank you, and open for any questions. Mike, shall I hand over to you to compare?
Yeah, that's fine. So thank you so much, Mark. That's absolutely incredible. And we've got quite a few questions coming through, so I'm going to dive straight in if that's okay. Can you talk a little bit about how sort of the program works for PGT students that are obviously on slightly shorter course and have less time to engage?
Yeah, I mean, so my original USP wasn't, my original metrics weren't focused on PGT. They were very much with the undergraduate space. But what we found is as we opened up over the pandemic, PGTs were really keen to be involved. And in reality, their engagement actually isn't any different. The same as an undergraduate. Some of them, we have students who've now got 10,000 points, which is like mind blowing. They've done everything with us over 3 years in undergraduates. We've got students who've got 100 points, and that's fine because they've taken what they need. The same amount of range is there with PGT. So actually there's not an awful lot of difference between them. At the moment, our PGT students can't overcredit, but there's no reason why we do that. So I think we'll probably look at that in the next iteration and bring that in. There has been a really lovely kind of vertical tutoring thing emerging. And some of our best projects are where you've got a PhD student working with a foundation student, working with a standard undergraduate, working with an international student based over in Malaysia. And that mixing pot is really interesting and not always actually as hierarchical as you would expect it to be. And I think, again, that's part of loosening the journey. Your definition and value and contribution to this space isn't about your hierarchy in the university system or your progression along a linear pathway. It's whatever emerges out of that space. It's a bit of a dodge to the question, but I think it's probably the authentic answer. Yeah.
Okay. I've obviously spent time with you hearing about some of the sort of individual projects and members of your awesome team as well, and the sort of approach in terms of the learning design is very different to sort of many traditional employability programs. Could you just give us maybe one more example of sort of one of these sort of landscapes in reality, sort of, another particular case study of sort of how they come to, they manifest in the sort of space?
Yeah, so, okay, so we really, some of what we do when we design a landscape is about efficiency for us as a delivery partner and a delivery organizer, and making sure that we spend university money appropriately. Really good example is around sign language. So loads of students want to learn sign language. So what we've done is we've created a self-study pack with a partner, which loads of students can engage with. So everyone can do this self-study pack if they want, and loads of them have done. We then funnel those students into an opportunity to come and do a 6-week course. And then we funnel those students into an opportunity to come and do a full level 1 qualification with us. So there's almost like there's a linear pathway through those where you're unlocking. Again, it's come from Zelda. It's about dungeons, and you've gone into your shrine, and that's giving you another zone. And your entry point is you've done this at this micro course, which has opened up a space on the landscape. But you know what? It also opened up a load of other spaces. So it opened up an opportunity to go and do volunteering with Manchester Deaf Centre. It opened up some schools-based placement work, supporting deaf students within settings. It opened up the ability to do a further course on supporting English as an additional language. So you can kind of see there then how like these navigation points open by merit of how you've engaged. Was it that kind of example?
Yeah, fascinating. So one of the things that I think is particularly inspiring as well, and I think a lot of the best employability initiatives are really, closely linked to the civic agenda. And one of the things I've been really impressed by with RISE is how you've opened it up to the general public as well. So do you want to just briefly talk about that?
Yeah. So we again through the pandemic, we realized that a lot of the stuff we were creating, what we did was we created a load of content which was self-study, self-engagement. And we partly did that because we didn't know that all of the activities we were going to arrange might go under because people were ill with COVID. So we created this like resilient core that would always be there. We very quickly realized that that didn't cost us anything to open up to the public. So we did. And it was kind of that simple that okay, all of this asset is out there to our public. But we also started to think about how we pivot our students to be part of that civic space. So some of our activities became about well-being outreach around art, and our students ran workshops for the public. So it kind of just snowballed out of that, of wherever there's a space for that porousness, the only thing that's stopping us doing that is just the will to do it. Yeah. It has no cost implication. It only generates benefits. And what's come out of that is loads of extra partnership, kind of quite big kind of corporate levels, but also at grassroots community levels of people who want to work with our students. And that service learning evolution has been really, really interesting.
Yeah. I think every conference I've ever been to around this is when people hear something incredible, they're like, yeah, but they must have hundreds of people working on this. Obviously, I know that's not the case. So a couple of people have been asking, what the sort of resourcing is. So do you want to talk about sort of your team? And I know it obviously brings in people from across the institution as well, but
yeah, so it's me.
Yeah,
it's me and John. Yeah. No, so we've run it in the pilot with so me as the academic lead and John, who does like unit leadership, quality assurance and student experience work. We have Sarah, who does admin of the stuff, does all our contracting and organization. We have Rosie, who does data, and we have a couple of what I call experiential learning tutors who've been absolutely valuable. So CJ and Elle have developed a really good expertise at working alongside students, employers, partners, and turning an opportunity into a teachable moment. And I think it's a capability that's often missing in universities, because you have kind of very formal teaching experience who can deliver content, and you have a kind of careers partnership expertise, which is about the bringing connection in. And there's often a black box in what then happens. So yes. What we've tried to do is develop that capability. And as we've moved into business as usual, I've now got 4 of those working in partnership with faculties, and brokering those partnerships. We also have a cash budget for buying things in, but that's pretty much it. I think the thing that's going to make the difference is that resource, though. It's those experiential learning tutors and their ability to unlock these things. There was also a question in the chat about what platform we use, which is kind of connected to this. It's a hacked WordPress. Don't tell the information officer. Again, it was one of the brilliant consequences of the pandemic, was that we had a bit more space to develop what we needed in the spaces that we had. So we took a WordPress site and I coded it to death in order to create the prototype of what we've got. And it's allowed us to pivot really quickly. We're now going to need to bed that into something a bit more enterprise grade. But that's the next step. I need to stop fiddling with it first.
Yeah, and I think going back to sort of the learning design elements, I think one of the things that struck me, and I spoke to Elle and as part of the project I did with MMU, is the sort of bravery required to sort of deliver in this way as well. And I think, I think it's a mindset shift in terms of like, there is no fixed endpoint for a lot of these projects and assignments, and there's no expectation that all people are going to get to this point and there's going to be this outcome. And I think that is a big shift for some people. And I think we and through sort of removing that element, then it allows for so much more innovation, so much more creativity, so many different divergent journeys. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think on all sides. So I think staff and partners actually are really, really nervous about anything that isn't a careers talk. And moving into something a bit more frontier. They're worried about it going wrong. They're worried about it not succeeding. In reality, the students are well up for it and they don't care. I think as long as you've got a really honest relationship with them, like, come on, let's mess with this and see what happens. And when it all falls down, we have a giggle and then we work out why it's not worked. It's generally fine and it isn't damaging or counterproductive. On the other side, we've seen really, really interesting risk-taking behaviors with students. So we've had students taking things because they look hard, which is just, we don't recognize that. Why would they? Nothing is set up in their experience for them to behave like that. However, this is because you can't lose. My favorite story is always the student who took Mandarin because it looked hard. Absolutely tanked at it. She turned up every day and failed to learn Mandarin, but wrote me a blinding assignment about resilience. And it reminds me of that. It's that triad. It's about taking that, turning it into an asset, finding your authority within it, being plastic with that as an experience. It isn't about Mandarin. It's about me as a human being and why you would want me. And it's about the autonomy to manage yourself through that.
Awesome. I'd love to talk to you all day, Mark, to be honest, but we have got to move on. Thank you so much. It's been as brilliant as I knew it would be. I really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy, and thanks very much for sharing with us.